Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, The Grant Specialist. My name is Chinmay and I'm your grant specialist. Today we'll be looking at the NHMRC's grantee variation policy. So I'll be explaining the guidelines for that. For this video, if you have an NHMRC successful grant, this video is for you. So we'll look into a few things here, which is it starts with the introduction. What are the principles of variations? Some notes to the RAOs and the chief investigators, the types of variations that can be submitted, the process for variation, as well as some key contacts. All right, so introduction. So what is a grant variation? A grant variation is essentially a change to a successful grant. So you hold a successful grant with NHMRC, and there are some circumstances which has led you to request a change to a successful grant. That's called variation. So this change may include anything from a change to a funding period. So you might want to extend the grant, or for example, you had a delayed start date or a delay during the grant, or a change to an end date, or it might be changed to a research team, a research activity. If you're moving across to a different organization, it might be changed to a transfer. You might want to transfer your grant to another organization, and so on and so forth. And we'll be looking at each of them later in this video. So it applies to all the NHMRC funded projects. So this variations policy, the grantee variation policy, is going to apply to all the projects that are funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. It does not apply to the MRFF funded projects. What's MRFF? It's called the Medical Research Future Fund. So for projects that are successful for the MRFF, they have a different variations policy that we'll be looking at in the next videos. Some key resources there. So I've hyperlinked the NHMRC's grantee variation policies. So you can click there and go to their website and have a look at it yourself as well. Some principles. So when you submit a variation request, NHMRC has some sort of policies, or they have some criteria under which they'll be considering your variation request for your grant. One is they'll consider the individual circumstances that you outline in a variation request. Do they align with the NHMRC's required change of circumstances policy, for submitting a variation? Does your variation align with the grant opportunity guidelines that your application was submitted in? So for example, you might have submitted an IDEAS grant back in 2022, and you're submitting a variation for your IDEAS grant. So NHMRC will go to those guidelines and see whether a variation was allowed in that grant guidelines for your grant. The third thing they'll look at is the fundamentals of the grant, of the actual grant, because NHMRC, when they're assessing your grant or they awarded you grant, they have had a specific criteria in the assessment policy as well. So they'll be looking at the fundamentals of the grant that was assessed in the original peer review process. NHMRC is essentially looking for the best outcome against the aims and objectives. So they look at whether this change is still going to give you them the best outcomes to the aims and objectives that you have defined in your project when it was successful. With this variation that you submit, does it still align with the purpose of the grant opportunity? Does it continue to add value to the Commonwealth money that was given to you for research? So is there a situation where because of this variation request, the value of the grant has reduced? If that's the case, they might not approve your variation requests. Also any other matters of which NHMRC might be aware of, which is administering institution or researchers involved in the grant, the other researchers involved in the grant. So they might even look at these things before they approve your request. Right? Well, a few things to remember here. So a variation request needs to be submitted on NHMRC's grant management system, which is Sapphire, and that needs to be submitted at least 30 days in advance prior to the date you want your desired effect to come into action. So let's say, for example, you want a variation to come into action 30 days from now. So you have to submit the request now for allowing enough time for NHMRC to action your request. Also, it has to be submitted to the RAO, and the RAO will further submit it to NHMRC. Now, some notes to research administrative officers and the chief investigators. Note to RAOs. So RAO is always the first point of contact for all grant administration matters right? So if you're a chief investigator, your first point of contact is your respective RAO. RAOs, which is the research administrative offices of your individual organization, of your respective organizations, are required to maintain a record of the reason of the proposed variation and any supportive documentation for that. So NHMRC reserves the right to come back if they need any further information when you submit the variation, and the RAO has to provide it to them. So administering institutions. So the RAOs of the administering institutions are required to manage the flow of funds in accordance with the varied arrangements, right? So for example, if the grant is extended, the RAO is responsible, or the administering institution itself is responsible to manage the movement of money or the changes that have occurred due to the variation that was approved. It's RAO's responsibility to manage that. Note to some chief investigators. So chief investigators, if you're a chief investigator, do not directly approach NHMRC for any questions relating to the variations. You might have seen in our previous videos, we always said if you had any questions, please contact NHMRC, but in this case, please do not. The first point of contact for you is your RAO. If you have any issues or any concerns or any points of discussion that you want to discuss right before you submit a variation request, do write an email to your respective RAOs and they will contact NHMRC on your behalf and get the relevant answer for you and give you the information before you submit a variation request. Do not, I repeat, do not contact NHMRC directly to discuss anything about your variation. Right, so and also one more important thing to note is if you extend your grant, right? So for example, if the grant was due to finish in 2025, but then you say, okay, hang on a minute, I want to extend the grant to 2026. So if that happens and NHMRC approves your variation request, so yours and the other team members, other chief investigators' eligibility to apply for new grants gets impacted as well. It's not just you, but 9 other people. So we strongly recommend before you submit any variation, get approval from all the chief investigators in your research team. So all the chief, and that is something that NHMRC assumes that you have done when you submit a variation to your grant. Right, so be very careful of this. You can extend the end date, but that will impact yours and other CIS's eligibility to apply for other grants depending on the guidelines that that are shown in the guidelines of the opportunities that you want to apply for. Be very careful with that. Now, as we discussed previously, NHMRC will only accept variations in exceptional circumstances. What's an exceptional circumstances from the NHMRC's perspective? So the circumstance that could not have been foreseen or was foreseen as a risk, but was considered extremely unlikely and is unable to be effectively managed or mitigated within the original plan. So a circumstance that you did not foresee or was foreseen to be a risk and was extremely unlikely to happen, and yeah, I mean if effectively managed and mitigated, it would have been controlled within the original research plan is an exceptional circumstance. So if your individual circumstance falls under this broader umbrella definition of exceptional circumstance, you can certainly submit a variation. We'll look at a bit into the variation process now. Right, so what happens is the chief investigator A, who is the lead CI. If you're a lead CI, you're a chief investigator A for NHMRC funded projects. So you review the variations policy and submit the variation on the Sapphire system. As we discussed, it has to be submitted on NHMRC's grant management system, which is Sapphire, to your respective RAO, the Research Administrative Office. So the Research Administrative Office will then review this policy and the alignment of your request with this policy, and also refer to the grant guidelines in which your application was submitted. And once all these 3 things align well, they will submit your variation request on your behalf to NHMRC. NHMRC will then review the request and make decisions on your variation request. It might be either approved or rejected, depends, right? And once the decision is made by NHMRC, NHMRC will notify the Research Administrative Office via email of their decision. right? So if it is approved, NHMRC's Sapphire system will be updated accordingly. For example, the milestones will be updated, the financial requirements will be updated, and so on and so forth. If it's the extension of the grant, the end date will be updated, and so on and so forth. So it depends on what updates are required, depends on what type of variation you have submitted. So if your variation request is approved, NHMRC will make the changes to your application on Sapphire. If the variation request is rejected, right, the RAO will be asked to confirm that the grant will continue as per the originally awarded or previously approved. So this is very critical. So if they reject a request, they'll ask the RAO if you're still happy to continue the grant as approved initially, or there's another variation which we'll discuss further to relinquish your grant. So if the circumstances are so dire that you cannot complete the grant as previously approved and in the timeline that was approved, then you will need to relinquish the grant, right? And we will look into the different types just in the next section. Oh, so we'll look at some different types of variations that you can submit to vary your NHMRC successful grant. So the first one is deferring commencement. So NHMRC expects that your project starts on the date that you have recommended to NHMRC that it will start on in your project application. So for example, so there's a time period between the time when the grant is successful to the time when the grant actually starts, when the activity starts. There might be different things that can happen in this time period. For example, there might be delay in getting the agreements with the participating institutions organized, or there might be personal circumstances. For people with investigator grants, there might be visa issues that the CIA can experience when coming to Australia. So all these circumstances, so you can defer the commencement date of your project based on all these circumstances. So please submit a variation at least a month in advance, as I previously discussed, so that the variation can come into effect in a month's time. So now we look into deferring progress grant. So deferring commencement is submitted before the commencement date of the grant. Defer in progress variation is meant for deferring an in progress grant. So the grant has already commenced, and that's the reason there has been some instances, uncontrollable or exceptional circumstances that have occurred, which is leading you to defer an in progress grant. So deferring an in progress grant stops the clock for the period of deferment and then starts the clock again. It might be due to any circumstances, might be delaying. If your project is about clinical trials, it might be due to delay in recruiting participants, or in general it might be delay in conducting the interviews, or there might be some unforeseen circumstances in a particular area which your research activity is going to be conducted in. So I mean, it might be that, or it might be any personal circumstances that might be leading you to defer an in progress project. Extended leave request is the third one. So this is meant for this type of variation is usually submitted by CIAs when they are going on an extended leave. Either it might be a mat leave, or it might be a long service leave, or whatever, where they won't be working on the grant. So it's similar to suspension of the grant. So in an extended leave request, the end date of the grant just moves ahead by the amount of time the request has been approved for. If it's an investigator grant, we'll look into that a bit further, where it says IG fully suspend or partially suspending the grant. So if it's full suspension of the grant, for investigator grant recipients, the PSP, which is the salary component, and the RSP, which is the research support package, both are suspended, and the time period, the end date gets shifted by the duration of the suspension. However, if it's a partial suspension, only the PSP, which is the salary component, gets suspended. However, the the RSP, which is a research support package, continues to be given to the CIA to conduct the project in their absence by someone else. So in that case, the time period doesn't shift. So it's just because the activity is expected to continue when the grant is suspended. The next one is the extension of end date. So this is usually submitted towards the end of the project. Now what happens here is let's say that there has been some delays in the project during the period of the project, or there might have been unforeseen circumstances during this period, just primarily request NHMRC to extend the end date of their current grant. The next one is the change in the full-time equivalent. So usually it might be that NHMRC has approved your grant at a part-time basis or a full-time basis. For example, for investigator grants, the FTE might be part-time FTE due to personal reasons or part-time due to professional reasons, and so on and so forth. So this is primarily focused on investigator grant applicants where it's part-time personal and part-time professional activities come into play. So if you are actually changing the FTE, reducing the FTE, that is approved on case-by-case basis. When it is increasing the FTE, that is also based on case-by-case basis, right? So increasing the FTE can only be submitted in circumstances where the investigator grants either a part-time personal or a part-time professional, right? The reduction in FTE happens when it is a full-time investigator grant, a part-time personal grant, or a part-time professional grant. The next one will be relinquishing your grant. So there are instances where you can't hold two fellowships from two different sources. So for example, you win an NHMRC investigator grant as well as an ARC fellowship, and you can't hold both, so you have to relinquish one. So you might have to relinquish the grant, and you decide to relinquish your NHMRC once. So that is the variation that you need to submit for relinquishing your grant. Transferring and administering institution. So this is very important. So this variation comes into play when you're actually moving to a different organization. You're a CIA on the project, and the grant needs to be moved to a different organization. Right. So in this case, the new organization should be happy to accept your grant, as well as the relinquishing or the organization from which the grant is transferred should be okay to let you transfer the grant. So there are two sides of the story to this thing. So what happens is the primary institution tells the new organization saying, well, this grant is going to grant is going to be transferred to you, and they give them the dollar value of an unspent funds at their organization. The new organization will raise an invoice. Once the invoice is raised, the money will be paid by what the initial administering organization to the new administering organization, and the initial administering organizations, they will provide a financial equity to NHMRC saying, well, the money has now been transferred or will be transferred, and NHMRC will then give the new administering institution a transfer schedule which gets into effect from the date the new institution accepts the grant at their organization, right? So the further payments, except the payment from the initial administering institution, will not begin unless the new organization is going to accept the grant. So change of research plan is the next one. So change of the research plan happens when your research activity changes. By that, I mean the aims or the objectives of the research change. That is when the research plan will come into picture. Usually, and this is approved or considered by NHMRC on a case-by-case basis. Usually, if it is an improvement to the technique that you proposed in the beginning, that okay, this is an improvement to the technique by which I'm going to achieve my goals and objectives, which remain the same based on what was prescribed in the previous application. In the application when I submitted that, you don't need to submit this variation. It's only when the aims or objectives change. Change to the CIs. So this is a very critical one. So the CI team and the research team is approved, right, by the assessors, and then you have been given the funding based on the capability of the CI team, the quality of the project, how the value that it has to the Commonwealth money, and so on and so forth. If the CI team changes, then that's a massive change to the project, because the team capability part that was there in your application when you submitted it is in question again, right? So I mean, when you have a CI change, that will be assessed by NHMRC based on case-by-case basis. It's not that they'll always approve it, so be very careful of what you're submitting. If you are a CI, let's say for example, you're willing to apply or you're trying to apply for a different grant, however, you can't apply to that grant because based on the eligibility requirements for the new grant, you can't apply because you're a CI on the grant that is successful. you cannot submit a variation to change the CI. So what that means is eligibility adjustments cannot be made through this type of variation. So because NHMRC understands that when you signed the agreement, when you accepted the funding agreement or accepted the invitation to be a CI on Sapphire, you accepted being a part of the application for the duration of the project and not just for X duration of the project when the new opportunity came up. The last one is change of supervisor. It is for research professionals and the professional PhD sort of people. So if they have to change the supervisor, they have to submit a variation, and the supervisor for those that PhD assigned to that project or the postgraduate scholarship assigned to that project will change, right? So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact. Please feel free to comment down below. And yes, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And if you have and do let me know in the comments if you want any specific videos moving further on this topic, and we will try to accommodate your requests. Thank you.